Hello and welcome to the second presentation in the seminar series today. It's good to be back again presenting to you all. Unfortunately, not in person once again due to current circumstances, but hopefully that'll all change soon and we'll be able to be in the same room and connecting properly. So today we're going to talk a little bit about licensing deal structures, term sheets, what should be in them, how to prepare them, and then what happens beyond that, some of the things to look out for when negotiating that deal. Bearing in mind, of course, negotiation starts right at the beginning, way before you get to these points. You're always really negotiating and setting value for your asset. We'll take it for granted that you've got to this point, and for those of you that were in the previous seminar series, you'll have heard us talk about the process of getting through a deal and the things that happen with that. So we'll assume that you've done a valuation of your asset or whatever it is you're licensing, and you've found some comparables, some comparable deals, and you understand the market landscape and the other things that are in the space that you're doing your deal in, and that you've engaged with people, there's interest been shown, people have done a little bit of confidential disclosure, there's been some diligence, you may have given them access to a data room, at least to a degree, and now you're getting to the point where you want to solicit and get a non-binding offer, also called an indicative offer, from the other side. And those indicative offers usually take the form of a term sheet. And that's what we're going to start talking about first. So who drafts the term sheet, how you manage that process, what items you need to put in the term sheet, and then if you've got multiple people you're in dialogue with, how you judge one submission of a term sheet from somebody else's, so that you can make judgments about who's a better partner for you. So who drafts it? The first question. Usually it's the other side. If you're the seller, the potential licensee will draft and submit a set of terms. And remember, these are non-binding terms. So they're just their indicative offer, what they think based on what they know, they are prepared to do in a deal in a sense of the terms. Typically, they will have a defined lifespan. So when the term sheet is submitted, it says this indicative offer is good for 30, 60 or 90 days perhaps. So in that sense already you will understand the importance of getting all the term sheets in the same sort of time frame. Usually we try and get them to be submitted within 1 to 2 weeks of each other, so you've got a little time and they're all together. If they're coming in one after the other, you don't know whether to accept or decline one in the hope that a better one comes along and you then get a worse one. So it can be an awful mess. We'll talk about process letters. Process letters are a very useful tool and they come into play through the negotiation process and the deal process. Communicate clearly, and usually it's good to have a single person on each side as the point person who will manage the communications. That gets a little more complicated when you come together because you need various people participating. Try and treat everyone the same so that everybody is getting the same information or same level of information, which so the offers don't get skewed particularly, and try and give guidance when asked. I put this little cartoon up here. It's from The Simpsons. I don't know if it translates across to Korea, but there is a saying if you put enough monkeys in a room with typewriters, eventually they'll produce the works of Shakespeare. The same is not true for getting a deal done. If you put multiple business developers and lawyers in a room and let them free without a process in place, it probably will never get there. And clearly it does get there because lots of deals get done. So process letters, they're important and we use them to set a timetable. So when you've got people into the data room, it's a good thing to issue a process letter and tell them how long they're going to have in the data room. Usually 6 to 8 weeks. It might be a little shorter depending on the nature of the asset. And then say at the end of that point, you are expecting them to submit a non-binding or indicative offer. And then within that process letter, you will want to give them guidance on what should be in their indicative offer. And there are reasons for doing that. You want them to give you an offer which is suitable for you. and you want to be able to understand how they think about the components that are important to you. And so within that process letter, these sort of things, and this is not an exhaustive list, should be included, and you should ask them to either fill in numbers or comment against each of these particular areas. And so just running through some of these, what is it what indication do they actually want a license from you? It may be you have a technology which is applicable, say, across multiple things in one therapeutic area, like CNS. You might have a delivery technology, but they might only be interested in Parkinson's. So if one party is interested in all areas and one party not, you may look upon one as a better partner than the other, depending on what you want. And also what geographies, what territories they're interested in, because not everybody will want to take all territories. And it may be that in consideration of all the parameters, that doing 2 or 3 deals covering, say, US, Europe, Asia Pac, actually is a better return for you as the licensor than doing one deal to a global player who maybe doesn't have such good representation in some areas. Second one, obviously you want to know how much they're going to pay you. And you should ask for how much will you pay up front, how much will you pay in milestones, and what royalty rates will you pay, and what will be the triggers for those. Will it be entry into a clinical trial, regulatory approval, sales in a different country? Will there be milestones for particular sales or sales levels? So to get an idea of that area, you should also ask them about manufacturing, whether they wish to take over manufacturing, or if you intend to manufacture and supply for them, to say that is your intent. The fourth one there, where are they going to get the money from to pay you? Not all companies have huge amounts of cash. So if they have to go to, say, public markets to raise money, then there is a question mark about whether would they be able to do that. If they have to go to raise venture capital, would they be able to do that? But if they're just investing off their balance sheet and they can do that because they're a very big company, then that's a different consideration. And again, all these help you make judgments one against the other. The timing, how long it takes to close the deal. Normally, people will say they can close the deal within 90 days of the binding offer being accepted, and that's the binding offer, not the non-binding offer. But you may wish to close quickly. You may indicate preference will be given to parties who can close a deal in 60 days, if that's important to you, because that might dovetail with an IPO strategy or something similar. You need to know if they're using advisors and who their lawyers are, because you will have to have a dialogue with them, and they will have to be involved. The next one, 7, is an important one. How far is the proposed transaction being discussed within the licensee company? Has it gone to CEO level and corporate level? Has it gone beyond that to board level? And have they given an approval subject to terms? Or is it just the therapeutic area or business development? Because again, a company that's got a green light to go all the way through may be viewed more favourably than somebody who's got yet to go to the CEO and ask if they can do this. And it may not be just the CEO and C-level that approves this, as it says there. They may need to get board approval or even shareholder approval, depending on the nature of the deal. So all these things add different colour to the term sheet. And you need to understand those. It's important because when these offers come in, they won't always fill every component in. They will change things because they want to, but you want to have enough comparability so that you can line them up against each other and say one offer is better than the other. And the aim here is to pick the best one, but you also may want to pick another one as a backup, or you may not be able to separate the best two. And it's no bad thing to take two companies through to further diligence and submission of binding offers, so you have a backup in case something goes wrong with one party. The people putting the most money on the table is not always the best partner. It's easy to focus on the financial elements, and that's obviously one of the biggest considerations. But it isn't always necessarily true that the ones putting the biggest numbers down is the best deal. And you'll see when we talk later on about typical deal structures and put some deals up, but often there are big numbers in, but you need to read beyond those and what they actually mean. And a case in point, we did a deal with a major pharma. We did take two parties through to from indicative offer through to further diligence and submission of binding offers. One party was offering better financial terms than the second party. They weren't hugely different, but they were better. The numbers were bigger. They were fairly comparable on the timing of the triggers. But actually, the party offering slightly less had better coverage territorially, was larger, had a bigger sales force, and had spelled out how they were going to commercialise the asset. And it was much better, and it was considered, therefore, that they would sell more, make more money. And so, therefore, even though they were offering the same in royalty terms, their percentage royalty was going to deliver more value back to the licensor than the other party. So hence, taking all those considerations in, who they were, where their territories was, how their ability to commercialise, things that you'd asked for in the term sheet and beyond, led to a decision that they were the best party. So all of these things are important in consideration of that. So we're moving to the next stage. So we've got those indicative offers in. We've picked a favourite one or two from that. What happens next? Within that sort of area, you may have instances, like it says at the top there, the people that you got on really well with and you thought were going to put a great offer in and made all the right signals, actually didn't put a really good offer in. And they're in danger of being fourth or fifth, and they're based on the criteria, you wouldn't take them through to the next round. We've had this during the process where some companies will ask for guidance, and we said earlier on, giving guidance is a good thing, but the guidance can be difficult. I had one company in the process literally called me up and said, "We want to make it through to the binding offer stage. What number do we have to write down?" And it would have been very easy just to say, "Oh, write X million down and you're guaranteed." But A, we'd got no feel for whether they would actually be able to deliver that, and B, it's conceivable if we told them the number that a number to write down, that other parties may have submitted a higher number and they still wouldn't get through. So the way to manage that sort of scenario is, if people ask for guidance, you can use comparable deals, so precedent deals that have happened. Find a few that are similar enough to what you're trying to achieve, share those with the other side and say, this will give you guidance in terms of the sort of thing we're looking for. Not exactly, but the sort of thing. And that should give them enough ability to modulate their offer. Similarly, we've had people where we've given guidance to and said things like, your upfront is too low, you need to at least double it. And they haven't. And eventually they've lost the deal. So they sometimes won't take the guidance, and you can only do so much. But it is at this point you can get modification of deal terms, so between indicative offers and final offers. And if the offers come in and you don't like them, it's perfectly acceptable to go back to parties and say, your offer isn't good enough, you need to increase it. Throughout this, remember you probably should have constructed that internal term sheet of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable to you as the licensor or the seller, and refer back to that, and also refer back to the evidence you have which substantiates and defends your position of value and therefore why you're justified in asking for what you're asking for, because they will be producing evidence to justify their bid, and if you can't defend your position, they're not going to change the numbers. It's equally okay to go back and ask for changes on things like territories. You may have decided that, having seen the offers, you want to keep territories for yourself, and you can go back and say, I wish to carve this territory out. Or you've got parties coming in saying, I'm only interested in China, so you may wish to do a separate China deal, and then the rest of the world goes elsewhere. But the bidders may have bid for the whole world, in which case you need to go back and say, can you modify your bid and exclude territories X and Y, please, because I don't wish to offer them to you. And similarly, on indications, we talked about that earlier, that if somebody wants every indication and you don't wish to license every indication, you may say, I'm only offering a license for this particular indication. So it may be, in oncology, I'm only offering non-small cell lung cancer, and they've asked for all oncology. Of course, if you reduce the scope, they may well reduce the bid. So be prepared for that too. If further people come through and you do this, and then you get to the binding offer stage, and again, this is managed through process letters, so you will want to send them a letter. I've said process letters are very useful. They are, because they spell out what you're expecting, but what they also do is allow the other side to go internally and say, I need to do certain things by certain times. And for them, they'll need a deal team. So they'll need legal, they'll need commercial, they'll need business development, they'll need clinical development people to input. And the company and the management have to commit that resource. So if they've got a letter in their hand from the licensor or the seller or Pa마벤처스 saying you need to do X by a certain day, they then have the ability to go and ask for that resource internally and get the job done. Invariably, they miss the deadline. Not always, but quite often, they'll come back and ask for an extra week. So build in contingency in terms of timing for allowing that to happen. So you've got a little bit of leeway if people say, I need a bit more time. And it's certainly one of your favourite and preferred partners, that you're able to give them that bit of extra time without upsetting everybody else. But there will come a point at which you have to say either you're in or you're out. And again, we've done that. Did it to a major pharma company and said, either if I don't receive your bid by close of business on Friday, you are out of the process. They did put a bid in, but you've got to be pretty confident you've got backups, and not sort of they go, okay, well, I can't do it, and they drop out and you've lost all possibility of a deal. Okay, so you get to that point, you have a couple of parties through, you're taking them through to further diligence, which they will do, and then hopefully they will submit a binding offer, which pretty much looks like the original indicative offer. It has the components in the term sheet, you've given them a bit of guidance, so they've modified it to your satisfaction, and you can pick the party that you wish to take through to contracting. So when you've accepted that offer, it's time to turn the 2-3 page term sheet into maybe 80, 90, 200, 300 page contract. And that's when the lawyers and the legal teams really get involved, and they start to take the lead. Now, their role is to construct a legal contract which will allow them, both sides, to work together in the future, develop the asset beyond where it is now, and hopefully ultimately take it to market and be a success. And what they also need to do is capture those terms you agreed, the financial, the territorial, the other pieces, within that contract. What they are not there to do is to renegotiate those terms that you've agreed. They're there to put a legal framework around it. And I have seen lawyers try and renegotiate terms, which is not ideal because it wastes time, and quite often lawyers charge by the amount of time they spend. So keeping them focused on the task of putting a contract together is very important. So no renegotiation. The term sheet really is just the beginning. There's an awful lot of work to do in negotiating the contract. The terms are all the bits, so they're all the positive bits, all the bits that everybody wants to do and believes will happen. The contract has to cover off all the positive bits and all the negative bits and the what ifs if things don't go as planned, and what the contingencies are. The seller, i.e. the licensor, would normally draft the first version. It's your sale, it's your asset. You would normally draft the first version, your lawyers capturing those terms, and then there will be a back and forth between the parties, where everybody reviewing, and eventually you'll reach a point where there's a need for everybody to get around a table. Hopefully we'll be in a world where that's a physical table in a location, and you can discuss things openly together. It's much better if you can, rather than a Zoom call or emails. Usually you would alternate between the location of the partner and you. So Seoul or South Korea, you maybe do the first meeting, and then maybe it's Boston or San Francisco or wherever, or somewhere in Europe for the next meeting. If the distances are large, or there's an urgency to conclude the deal, you may try and do it in just 1 or 2 meetings with maybe a third. But sometimes they do take a series of toing and froing, and each side has to play their part. When you're doing those face-to-face meetings, it's important to have suitable facilities, where there is a main room for everybody to be in, but each side has their own breakout room, because there will become times during the discussions where you'll want to put issues to one side and then discuss them separately. And you'll need to go out into a separate room to discuss whether you can or you can't. And again, this is going back to that list of internal term sheets, what you can and can't accept, and also remember those lists of things you're willing to trade and things you're not willing to trade. So you don't go out, first of all, with your ideal set of parameters for a contract and expect to get all of them, because you won't. So you've got to give yourself some room. Okay, so just to move back through to some of the key contractual terms. I'm not going to go through all of these because we're on a limited time here. But you can see some of these up here. So on the license, what are you actually licensing? An entire therapeutic area or uses? Are you carving out in any way? A quick word on the different deal types, and we'll come to those in a later session on different deal types. Collaborations and MTAs and option deals versus licensing deals. When you're negotiating a collaboration that may be based around a material transfer agreement, so there may be a material transfer agreement first, both sides maybe do some work, the outcome and the data will determine if you go into a collaboration or maybe a license deal or maybe even an option deal. So those things need to be captured within the MTA or a contract. And MTAs are contracts as well. They need to define what you're going to do, who's going to do what, who owns what that comes out the other end, what then you're not allowed to do, and what the expected outcome should be. Collaborations are what they say. It defines what both sides are going to do and should define what the endpoints are and what the purpose of those endpoints is. It to then enter into a good discussion in good faith to do a licensing deal, or if certain data are successfully produced, that the sides will enter into negotiations for a contract on maybe an option. Important to remember when we're talking about these later that option deals are different from licensing deals. There is less commitment from the licensee. It's easier for them to walk away without any damaging effect, or less damaging effect on them, but more damaging effect on you. So different structures are better for different situations. Are you licensing exclusively or non-exclusively? That will affect the terms and the values, or semi-exclusively, where you may be giving it's a platform technology where you're giving a limited number of licenses for a particular utility of a platform. Maybe you're giving 3 per indication. That's a way of maximizing value for you as a licensee. Think about sub-licensing rights. Will you allow them to sub-license, and will you put restrictions on that? You wouldn't want them sub-licensing back to your biggest competitor in your territory particularly. And what about if it's you're licensing in from a big player and they may want the right to license it back once you've reached a point at which you were intending to license it out to a big player for commercialization. IP, what IP is needed? Is it all of the IP? Is it certain rights of certain IP? Have you done freedom to operate searches? Do you know that they're going to be able to exploit the IP in their territory? They will do them as well. Considerations of background IP, your background IP, the IP you're licensing, their background IP, which may be necessary, and any new IP that's generated called foreground IP. Again, sub-licensing rights. And then around the IP field, who is responsible for maintaining the IP, either paying the fees and defending the IP if somebody transgresses the IP. Do you go after them and enforce your IP, or does the licensee do it? And who pays? Transfer of know-how. Again, know-how isn't time bounded like IP. How are you going to do that? Will you provide ongoing support that once you've transferred it? And within that know-how is things like regulatory filings. On know-how, it's an interesting one because it can be quite valuable. I know of an instance where the licensing deal was an asset was licensed in to a particular company who were going to develop it and license it out again. It came from a big pharma to a smaller player and was going back out to a big player. The IP wasn't particularly strong. It didn't have many years left on it, but the originator did have know-how on production and manufacturing of the drug and its purification and analytical methods to establish purification. And all of those are needed to get regulatory approval to move through clinical trials. They didn't give the licensee those methods. although they allowed them to use them and they gave them a right of reference for regulatory purposes. So they kept control, because for somebody else to step through and redo that, it would probably take them 5 or 10 years. So it was actually a sort of de facto exclusivity period by having that capability. So things like manufacturing know-how can be an important value and barrier to entry for other players and can be used in that way. Development plans, they're usually shared, but there comes a point where in advanced clinical development, if it's all being done by the other side, there may be little value in doing that, but you may wish to know what they're doing and insist on that. Commercially reasonable efforts is always a clause in contracts. They're in there. When they're in there, they have to be linked to a company of a similar size and capability, because otherwise, if you go down the litigation path because you don't think they've tried hard enough, unless those caveats are in there, it's hard to prove. It's always hard to prove anyway. And then who's doing the regulatory filings? Again, there's an interesting instance about regulatory filings, and it goes back to option deals and license deals. So in an option deal, you probably haven't transferred the regulatory filings because you're still holding them, and they get transferred at the point of licensing. And so you're responsible for them up until the point that you license. And so we're talking about regulatory filings, and in relation to things like option deals, you will hold on to those filings until the license is granted. And sometimes licenses are triggered by certain things, because you can get a situation whereby if a technology has come from, say, a university, they often have these sort of submarine clauses that call for a very high royalty rate if the asset is taken in from the university, say, and then licensed on very quickly. So what they do is put things in that say, if this is licensed before, say, phase 2 or phase 3, and a patient is dosed in one of those phases, then the royalty rate could be, say, 25-30%. As soon as that phase has started, the royalty rate may drop to 1 or 2%. So you can have a construct where it's an option deal, and then once a patient is dosed, the royalty rate falls away, and everything changes, and the value. So you need to guard against things like that. The other thing you need to think about as well is if once you've transferred the things like regulatory meeting control to the other side, if there are milestones associated with a regulatory meeting, and the other side has control of the timing of that, they could extend that period out and not take the regulatory meeting and not pay you the milestone. And if you're dependent upon that milestone for your company to survive, then you may have an issue with being strung out like that. Ways to manage that are, as if you identify things like that, is to then negotiate to move some of the money within the financial terms. So it's hard to change the total value of the financial terms, but you can move money around. There will be consequences. If you bring money forward, you may lose a bit at the back. But if it means you need it as a revenue source between, say, 2 clinical phases, which are triggered by a regulatory meeting, you may wish to do that. And so a few others. Commercialization, you need them to report to you on the sales they make and have a right of audit of those sales at least once a year. Manufacturing, who's doing it, will you still provide some materials for that or not? Will everything get taken over? What about existing supplier contracts? Will they be broken, and what were the consequences of that, so that the other party can take manufacturing on totally? Or will they survive and they're passed over? And when you're setting up those contracts, when you're developing, you may wish to make these considerations so that you can do that later on. We just talked about financial terms and whether you can move them, putting the desired triggers in place. The next one is a big one, termination. The consequences of termination takes a long time to negotiate. And these are what happens if we want to stop and give it back. The other side, they don't want to take it forward anymore for whatever reason, or it fails and they want to give it back. If they just want to stop doing and giving back, usually it comes back with some compensation because it's slightly damaged, they've taken time. and everybody will know that they gave it back. If they gave it back because they just changed strategic direction, you'll want to make sure you get all the data and everything else that comes with it, so that you can carry on the program. They'll probably give you some money because they've done it. They will want to be relieved of any liabilities going forwards. There may be dependency on IP that's been generated in the intervening time, which you'll need to get rights to. So all of these things have to be considered and put within the contracts. It does happen. One very well-known case is Antisoma. They had an asset, they licensed it out 3 times, and it came back every time, and each time it came back, they got 100 or so million with it. So make sure if it's going to come back, you get some compensation. If it comes back because it's a complete failure, that's less likely to happen. And then how's the process going forward going to be managed? Who's going to govern the contract? Usually the bigger player has the final say, but there will be committees that oversee the project. They may have equal representation. When there are disagreements, they'll get escalated, maybe up to CEOs. Ultimately, somebody has to make a decision. It's usually the bigger player, but sometimes it'll go to arbitration for dispute resolution, and then coverage of who's liable for what in what situation. So those last 3 or 4 are really, really important ones. They're as important as the positive ones of who pays for what and it's all successful, because things do go wrong and the contracts have to cover them. So the lawyers do earn their money in these situations, and crafting them well and having a good law firm to do that for you is very, very important. So when you get to the end point of the negotiations, you do get through them. Have experienced people in there with you. If you don't have the experience, maybe you've got board members who've done this before, or you can engage people like us who can help with that and have done this before. But you do get there. Successful deals are done, and here we've got a sample of a few that are relevant. They're all with Korean clients of ours. You probably know them all. There's Yuhan on there with a well-known deal with Janssen. Lego Chem Bio, we've helped on a couple of deals, and just the other week, a client of ours, GPCR Therapeutics, and their deal with Taigen, the Taiwanese company, who they actually licensed in from. So successful outcomes are good, and they do work very well. So I know there's a Q&A session later on, and be happy to take questions from folks then, or outside of this. Thank you very much for your attention.